Hydrofield cuts through my neighborhood.
Well, hello there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Fearlessly Authentic. I'm your host, Lucky, and I got Leo here. And we have the lovely. Hello, my dear. Welcome to the show.
Hiya, thank you.
So you're behind an avatar for a reason. And do you want to just give a little bit of whatever information you are willing to share about why you would be behind an avatar and a little bit maybe about, you know, whatever background information you do share publicly.
Okay, so I'm a retired doctor. I live in the UK. I retired about 10 years ago after I got sick, so I couldn't really work anymore. And I've been sort of a woman online since the early 2000s. And anyone who's been online and female knows just how violent men get towards women. You know, it's like what we get in ordinary society, but then amplified because there is just like no personal responsibility. It's just typing at a person. So I had my own, I used to write fiction, I used to write essays, I used to have lots of fans in a different language. And I also then experienced stalking and harassment and doxing and what have you. So I was like, I'm never doing that again. So when I started doing this, I was like, yeah, of course I'm going to just be, you know, an avatar, because it's just not worth it. I don't think that the moderation policies and law enforcement, nobody is clued in or cares really to protect women from that kind of violence. So, but I always thought, you know, I'll start this because this was different. This wasn't just me, you know, inventing stories or talking about various things. This was actually something that was relevant to my own work and my expertise and whatever. So I always thought, you know, there'll come a time, anytime soon, when I will be able to, you know, say who I am, because this is too serious. So that was 2016 that I came on Twitter. And it was like, anytime. It's 2023, I'm still pseudonymous. So, but yeah, I'm planning to come out under my real name probably this year, just because I think it's really important. I keep seeing women who have so much more to lose than I do being brave. And I think that, you know, it's a bit hypocritical of me to not do the same, even though I think for me, the main reason is because I've got asthma and my health and autoimmune and whatever. So this male violence, it just really hits you, you know, and it makes my breath go all over the place. So I think I was just protecting myself in that way, but I'm not that fragile anymore. So I think it's time. The time will come soon. So yeah, that's me.
Yeah, so I have your book right here. I love your book so much. I'm not done reading it, but like you know, you can see all my little tabs up here. You know, I'm marking pages, not marking the book, but marking the pages. And I love how you have it set up. I think that it's brilliant the way that you wrote it in essays. It makes it really easy to digest, and then all your source information is just right there. And being somebody who is always like, yeah, I always put my sources in my show notes, and you know, like I like to source everything. I just love that your book is set up that way, where it's just like it makes you feel like you're getting like genuine information that is coming, and that you can back it up yourself, and you can look into it further. It's such a great setup for a book, and I absolutely love it.
Thank you. I'm really glad. Yeah, it was under discussion. The format was under discussion more than once, and it was a bit of a brave choice to go this way because it is pretty unconventional. I mean, a friend of mine made a point to say that medical essays and feminist essays have a very long tradition in publishing, so it shouldn't really be that controversial. But right now, I think in publishing, there are all these hoops you have to jump through in order to publish anything that criticizes gender ideology. And in that sense, not only are there huge limitations that I wasn't prepared to really accept, but also anything unconventional, anything that can possibly compromise sales, publishers will be quite, averse to it. So yeah, I was early on when I looked into it, I was told to abandon the essay format, to write it as a book, and to just focus on medicine and basically not really worry about feminism so much. And I think at that time I just realized that time hasn't come yet for me to be able to publish the book the way the book that I wanted to publish in a traditional way. So I just said, I'll just do what I think is right, and I've self-published it in a way that I was happy with. And it was always a gamble, but the feedback has been so amazing that I'm just really glad that I did, because it was really anxiety provoking to do it. But I'm glad it's served its purpose, and people are getting out of it what I had hoped they would. So yeah.
And I love the title "Born in the Right Body," and that really hit home for me, because I told you, and I've told my audience before, but anybody who is listening that's new, I met my first my daughter was 6 when we met somebody that was transsexual, and that was the term that we used, was they feel like they were born in the wrong body, and it was meant to be something that was very simplistic. This was the way that you describe it to a child, because you have to describe complex things to children, and you have to have that ability as a parent. Well, you don't have to, but you should try to have that ability as a parent to describe something that is very complex to a child in a way that they'll be able to understand it. So like that was the phrase that we used, and I feel like it just got swept up and got turned into like how adults were describing it to other adults in a simplistic term. You know what I mean? Saying, oh, they're born in the wrong body. And it just kind of like went on from there, and then we're at where we are right now with the gender ideology, and it's just used so widespread and commonly, where it should have just been used as a simplistic, like just a metaphor. And so what made you think about like naming the book "Born in the Right Body"? Is that where that kind of like rooted from? Is that same conversation type thing that you were hearing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I became aware of transsexualism was, well, I mean, I've been aware, I've had luck to meet some people, boys, when I was still in high school, who were flirting with that idea, shall we say, and they were vulnerable, they were gay, they were, one of them was under the influence of an older man who was pushing him to do this, to quote unquote change his sex, or to undertake steps to appear more like a woman. So I've been exposed to that very early on. So I've heard this, born in the wrong body, I should have been a girl, this and that. And then, in the 90s, and then when I started working, you see this being a part of a transsexual narrative, which in medicine, we always used to take as, like you said, a metaphor. It's the metaphor for how they feel. It's not real. No one can be born in the wrong body because our bodies are us, you know. But the industry that has arisen around effeminate men and gender nonconformance, both for men and women, which our traditionalist society has always found very uncomfortable, for a variety of reasons that I go into in the book as well, you know, gender roles, male supremacy, male dominance, inherent nature of male dominance being based on what men are supposed to look like, what they're supposed to do. And then you have these men who do things that are more traditionally associated with women. Therefore, the whole concept of inherent male domination becomes questionable because, you know, it doesn't make sense anyway, right? And then these men had to be put into different box, you know, and the box that they got put into is a woman box. And that way the order is maintained, you know. And you can trace this back to, you know, early 20th century and the feminine essence, quote unquote, of homosexualism and of male homosexualism. But then at the same time, you know, since the early 20th century, you started getting this medical what I think is clinical abuse, basically, but I don't think necessarily it started as deliberate clinical abuse. I think they were all in that, you know, mindset of actually trying to hack people's bodies in order to bring about this so-called sex change. And this is now a thread that is continuing throughout the 20th century and now as well. So born in the wrong body being a metaphor, and the clinical practice of actually trying to fashion people's bodies to resemble the opposite sex has now been sold as a fact, and particularly to children. And I think, you know, there's many different theories about why children have been drawn into this. And I'm sure that there is many different reasons, you know, but I think one of the very powerful motivators was that male transsexuals, or male transvestites more accurately, so men who have sexual motivation to cross-dress, have traditionally doctored their personal narratives to claim that they've known that they were a woman or a girl in the boys' bodies when they were 5 months old or something. You know, these are, you know, 3 years old, 4 years old. An adult transsexual who cross-dresses for a variety of reasons will try to assert that it's not sexual, but it's actually innate. And I've known when I was 3, and there is no evidence that he knew anything when he was 3, but this is the narrative. And having this child now at 4 years of age being diagnosed as trans is in a way proof that adult males who cross-dress for sexual reasons are also innately born in the wrong body, etc. So it whitewashes the particularly difficult to manage motivation for why men cross-dress and why men want to emulate women. And I think this whole industry and this whole ideology was very much influenced, if not started, by male transvestites who wanted to, you know, basically obscure the sexual component of their paraphilia. So in all of this, it's very fascinating how, as a society, it's, you know, it's 21st century, we're still, you know, sweeping under the carpet anything sexual, anything deviant. We have this motivation to make everything pure and wonderful and to ignore the underbelly of society or the underbelly of human nature. So I think there is a real tension there of this kind of insistence that this is all pure and holy, to the point that, you know, they will say trans people are sacred, and then you've got a guy who, you know, is a criminal and abuses children, or, you know, whatever, under this guise of being a woman. But no, he's also sacred and holy. So it's just completely crazy. And in all of this, everyone's got caught in the middle of this, what has now become an idea and belief that has to be asserted as fact, because we cannot talk about anything else. But in all of that, as a doctor, what really concerned me the most is this escalation of this unethical practice that relies on this societal belief that mind and body are separate. So, you know, mind is almost like a soul, or it has, you know, a completely independent existence. And, it, you know, there can be a mismatch between your brain and your private parts or whatever, none of that really is real. But that is what is really communicated in this message, born in the wrong body. And you will see in the last 10 years things like, these people have female brains in their male bodies and things like that. And it's almost like a Lego approach to human being. This bit belongs to this sex, that bit belongs to the whole thing just makes no sense. And the outcome of it is that bodies get hurt, and because bodies are us, we cannot escape our bodies. The mind gets hurt as well, and the outcomes are so bad, and the harm is escalating. So in all of that, I thought, cutting through that. And actually, I was on Twitter and I asked various people, suggestions for a book title, because, I can write, but I can't think of titles. And the title is like a composite from the discussions and suggestions that people gave me. And one of them was, I think, Born in the Right Body. And I was like, brilliant. So I think that's how it came about. So it's meant to communicate, to assert this as a fact, and to give also a platform for the book, which is, the book then talks about that and breaks it down in many different ways to explain why you cannot actually be born in the wrong body. So whatever is happening here, being born in the wrong body is not it. So, and let's now see what's happening here. So, yeah.
Is there another book in the works?
No.
I think there should be. I love this one. I think that just being, a fan and all, I'm just like,
Thank you. Well, okay. So the thing is that my heart and soul are in fiction. So I actually, I'm almost finished writing my first proper novel in English, which I hope to publish at some point. So that was all interrupted in order to do this work. So whilst I can do this, it's like when you have two things that you're good at, and one thing saps your energy and makes you feel really depressed, and the other thing just like is your thing and you love and enjoy doing it. So this is for me fiction versus nonfiction. So I do have a memoir which I started writing, which is at about 40,000 words now, which I hope to put out one day. Its overarching theme is sexism in medicine, but it follows my personal experience and talks about the war in my country as well a little bit, and my experience from a medical family to medical student to becoming disabled and sick. Not every doctor has that experience. So there is something that can come out in that respect. But other than that, I'm really hoping that this medical scandal will be dealt with, and I will be able to go back to writing my detective novels and vampire novels and all that kind of stuff, which is where, what I really enjoy doing. So we'll see.
I love your accent too, by the way. I absolutely, I love it. I'm just like, I think it's just so beautiful. I listened to one of the other podcasts that you had sent me that you had done an interview with. And that was, I don't know, probably a good month ago or so. But I remember just feeling like, oh my gosh, I love your accent. So people are often like confusing sex and gender, and I try to not even use the term gender anymore, and I just try to say like based on sex, like, because I feel like that erases a whole lot of confusion. I mean, there is, I think there's like 116 or something different genders that they've come up with now. Can you elaborate a little bit on the differentiations between the sex and the gender? Because I feel like that is often like confused for people. And what is your opinion on that?
Well, it was very interesting when I came to Australia and got into medical school, because my native language is Serbo-Croatian. So the language is, our language has gendered nouns, like French, or like, I think Spanish has it as well. So, a cat, Machka, is feminine, even though you have cats of both sexes, but the word itself is feminine. So, in languages like that, it's not necessarily that the gender of a word signifies the biological sex of what is being spoken to. Even things like a chair has a gender in grammar. And we have very distinct understandings of sex and gender. Sex is something that affects living beings. Gender is something that affects nouns. It's a grammatical term, And I arrived to Australia and I started reading, medical literature, and I kept seeing this word gender being used instead of sex. And it really struck me because, in Yugoslavia, we were atheists and socialists, and sex was not as a taboo topic as it may be in countries that are still very much in a Christian mindset and all that. And I found it very curious and interesting how prudish, in my opinion, people were, that they couldn't bring themselves to use the word sex, just because it also means intercourse. But I didn't really think a lot of it. It irked me. I just felt that it was like, this doesn't really, I felt some kind of way about it, but I didn't really know why. And, fast forward 20 years now, I know why, right? So it's like, oh no, what are you doing? So the way feminists, I think from a feminist point of view, because I think feminist analysis is just so useful in this situation. Sex is why women are oppressed, and gender is how they are oppressed. So gender is a hierarchy of traits which are ascribed to people based on their sex. And it just so happens that women are always weaker, home-oriented, less rational, all of these things. That's your gender, right? But so John Money, who is one of the guys who is deeply embroiled in this practice, he was experimenting on children with differences of sex development. They were experimenting on transsexuals, all that kind of stuff. So he proposed that the word gender means sex role stereotypes. And that kind of absolutely makes sense. But I think, so what happened quite deliberately with the lobby that wanted to bring things to this point that we are at now, where everyone is being, having these operations and interventions, and no one knows who is female, who is male anymore, by the way we speak, and men can enter women-only spaces at will. I think that they have used this, both the feminist analysis of gender as opposed to sex and why gender oppresses women, as well as the medical and scientific prudishness and swapping the two to sow confusion. So now, they could be talking about gender, but saying that a woman is a gender, whereas a woman is a sex. But then you say, no, a woman is a sex. And they will say, well, sex and gender are different, don't you know? So it's completely incoherent, but it's going back and forth, and it can be manipulated in a way that we now got that a man has a gender of a woman, and the woman is a gender, i.e. high heels and long hair and a lipstick on a man, as opposed to a category of human that, has a female sex. So yeah, it's very convoluted, and it can look completely mad on the surface, but I think gender ideology is fiendishly clever. I think some very intelligent people are behind all of these confusions, linguistic confusions, scientific confusions, which is why it was actually really quite difficult, and for me very important, to explain this to people, because it's easy to dismiss, but we dismiss them at our peril. We really need to understand what's underlying this, how this came to be, what is real, what isn't, what science shows, what doesn't, what language, what definitions are, what aren't, in order to actually unpack this, because otherwise this is just going to run, and they will just, take, I don't know, an administrator in a major hospital and tell them a load of nonsense, and they will just nod their head, go, oh, it sounds like a good idea. And next thing you know, mastectomies on 13-year-olds. So, it's a lot is at stake right now. So I think, yeah, the whole sex and gender conflation has been absolutely central to what is going on.
Yeah, it seems like it's a very linguistic based movement, where it's very confusing. Like, and I can't help but think that that's on purpose. You know what I mean? Especially, yeah, with somebody like Dr. Money. Now I've looked into him, and I haven't studied all of everything about him. I lost sleep looking into his practices and what he's done, and I was floored that he is, in at least in the United States, a lot of he's praised as being this this revolutionary doctor, and it's based on horrific, sinister things. Like, I'm just, it just always floors me when it comes to Dr. Money, Dr. Kinsey, and some of these other, these other doctors. Like, I mean, how are they spoken about, like, in the, like, when you're learning medicine? Like, how are these doctors spoken about? Are they spoken about in a positive light, or is it are they honest about, what they've done, like how they've
Well,
come?
I was in medical school when it all went down with John Money. So one year we were in lecture theater with a giddy professor going, "Oh my God, you have, could a brain be the opposite sex? Because we have brain sex and we have hormonal sex and this and that," which is a bastardization originally of John Money's concepts, which he identified purely in relation to people who he referred to as hermaphrodites or pseudo-hermaphrodites, which is a derogatory term we don't use anymore for people with disorders of sex development. So people who, for example, appear more female on the outside but have internal male sex organs and their biological sex is male. So there is, traditionally what is called intersex. So, and particularly, medicine before, if you can imagine Money operating in 50s and 60s and 70s, medical investigations, and what we had at our disposal was a lot less than now, so people had to kind of visually conclude and identify and try to figure things out, as opposed to just doing a karyotype test or looking inside with a scope or an X-ray or a CT scan or what have you. So John Money talked about how these particular people who have a mix of sex characteristics because of their disorders, how you can look at their hormone profile, you can look at their psychological makeup and how they feel, you can look at their sex organs, you can look at their outwardly appearance, and these are different ways of talking about sex and trying to figure out what is happening with these people, really, Whereas, so I was like at uni in the 90s, and I remember the professor, Money was still very much the it guy, of DSD treatment and of this whole philosophy of gender identity, chiefly because it transpired later that because he lied about the success of his experiments, and because this is a tiny population, very marginalized, many doctors go through their entire practice encountering maybe one or two of these people. So, and they're seen in specialized contexts and they're very rare.
I'm actually friends with two intersex people, and it's really interesting how they are pulled into this all the time. But, like, not by the medical, like, professionals, but by the people that are pushing gender ideology onto others. They oftentimes will pull in, "Oh, well, what about intersex people?" And I'm like, "Oh, well, have you talked to any intersex people? Like, have you actually had a conversation with them? Have you asked them how they feel about this? Because you're using them on behalf of your ideology." And the people that I know, at least, in my personal life, are like, absolutely not. They are not for your gender ideology. And they were harmed, because of doctors and like they do not support Dr. Money and what he has done.
No.
So I find that really interesting that people do that without, and like you're saying, they're very rare people, so
you had this is another extremely clever tactic by the gender lobby. They've exploited things that they could see could work in order to bring this about, and particularly with linguistic conventions around people with intersex conditions, because when we in our medical papers, when we talk about an 46XY female, it is a linguistic connection to honor patient's gender identity, because that patient might look like a female, or might have taken treatments that feminize them more, because otherwise they would look quite androgynous. And, you know, there is so much stigma around not looking the way a male or a woman is, a man or a woman is supposed to look like. So medicine has a long history of pushing people with intersex conditions into treatments that will normalize them, quote unquote, according to one sex or the other. So in medicine, we've developed these linguistic conventions where we will talk about, we will first of all refer to a biological male who appears as a woman externally, as a woman. And in papers, we will refer to them as 46XY female. Doctors know that we're talking about a biological male here with a DSD condition. That's the convention. But the trans activists have taken that and said, see, there are all these papers in medicine that prove that females also can have XY chromosomes. It's like, that's not what it proves. This is medical way of speaking about real people who have their own identities, who have their own medical conditions, who need to be respected where they are without traumatizing them by writing about them in a way that they feel is insensitive. But they have now taken that and said that Lucas, a 50-year-old father of 6 who wants to identify as a 9-year-old girl, is equally entitled to the convention as a person with, for example, androgen insensitivity syndrome, who has had health issues and identity issues, and through no fault of their own whatsoever. So it is it's a very nasty ideology in that sense. But what happened when I was in medical school, one year, professor was giddy about how amazing this is, and, you know, who knows what sex we all are, and blah, blah. And then David Raymer, one of John Money's patients, spoke out about horrific abuse. And he was supposed to be the famous case where John Money's experiments worked beautifully. And he and his brother was so horrifically abused by Money and his colleagues that both of them ended up committing suicide. And the very next year, I remember sitting in that lecture theater learning about what happened to David Raymer, and it was an absolute shock that just ran through all of us. It was that moment that medical profession realized what was being done to DSD children, what was being done by John Money, that it was all one big old lie. So, but that was in the 90s. We're now, 25, 30 years down the line, and they even managed to use that and erase history and misappropriate it, so that now perfectly healthy children are having their sex organs mutilated the way that DSD babies used to. And they're using this consent model, which is based on basically misleading patients about the realities of treatment. And it's just like one of those moments where you just put your head in your hands and you just don't really know what else to do. But you've got to pick yourself up and you've got to unpack it and you've got to do something to try to help. So, yeah.
I know. I feel like we need to have a level of, of compassion and not shame people that are born the way that they're born.
Yeah.
I feel like we skipped that in society at some point, you know what I mean? And then there's like this forced into the binary, and it's like, that I grew up, I was absolutely a tomboy, you know what I mean? Like I would have been an ideal candidate for this right now. And I completely am 100% aware of it. And I think that is what, that's a trigger point for me. It's like, oh, wow, like I would have been, I would have been a prime target for this. And I see that, and I think back to like, being a vulnerable and a teenager and just, I don't know when puberty became optional for people. It was never an optional thing for me. And I think that we are failing our kids and the generations, we are failing as adults. We are failing the children by letting them think that puberty is optional or that, that it's going to, like, if you don't like it, then there's something wrong and you were born in the wrong body. Like, that's just not the case. Puberty is awkward, weird. I mean, like, you can physically see it in people as they, if you watch somebody growing up, and you can just even look through like pictures of somebody's life. There is an awkward stage that everybody goes through.
Yeah.
And it's that's the puberty stage. And people, like, like the whole ugly duckling thing, like, people go through that, and it's a huge transformation in our lives, and it's not always fun, and there's a lot of changes, and a lot of, you have growing pains, and your emotions are like, like you're figuring out the world, but it's a rite of passage. And I feel like they're taking that away from kids, and they're stunting them into like staying in this, like, very immature prepubescent kind of like in limbo, like they're like kind of like in purgatory with puberty, you know what I mean? Like they just don't get to fully come out of it. And I don't know what damage that's going to do. Like what kind of damage is that going to do to their brains? What is that going to do to their, their development into adulthood? I question a lot of it, and I see, there are certain influencers that we know on Twitter that you'll see that kind of behavior with them, and you recognize that there is definitely something that has stunted them from development. And it's alarming to me that this is becoming normalized. And I don't think it should be, especially with children, especially with the children. Like, it just breaks my heart.
Well, I think it all stems from, I mean, I will say men. I know it's not just men, and I know it's not all men, obviously, but men have this tendency of just running with whatever idea they have. They're less likely to be tethered to the earth, to biology. Girls start to menstruate. You cannot get away from that. You cannot be a child forever when you're bleeding once a month, and you know exactly what that does and what that predisposes you to being pregnant. And next thing you know, you have a baby and there is an earth reality biology connection that women have that men have less of, or are predisposed to have less of it. And men have historically been subject to very fanciful ideas, haven't they? Just completely like, what are you talking about? Even women in their real lives, ordinary lives with men, just go, oh, come down to earth, please, kind of run off with your imagination. And I feel that this is very much like that. This whole idea that you can somehow control nature, surpass nature. And it's not surprising that one of the very kind of powerful background influences is this transhumanism cult, which has a man as a guru and a leader, and fantasizes about dissociation between this pure mind and soul from the fallible, vulnerable, fleshy cage. So I think that kind of fancy idea is what is responsible. And I think when you look at the history of puberty blockade for this purpose, it's a man's brainchild, really. But yeah, it's an abomination, to use a pretty strong word. It just does nothing but harm people. It is harm. There is nothing else. You cannot not have puberty any more than you can. The only way to not have puberty is to die as a child. This is a normal human development. And there is an excellent...
It's a human right. I feel like it's a human right that's being taken away from them.
Yeah.
And I don't even know what it is as being taken from them, because they didn't get to go through it, and they didn't get to develop that, and their brain didn't get to develop it.
It's
so
a crucial period. It's a crucial stage in development. We grow in size, our sex organs and our gonads mature, our brain architecture matures. This is just a process, between, any life has the beginning and an end, and there are different formative stages during it. Some of them are psychological and social, some of them are purely biological, and puberty is a purely biological stage in a human and mammal and basically most animals' development. To just kind of have an idea that you can just do away with one stage, it's the same as this Lego approach to being male or female. Oh, I'm going to swap the penis for a vagina, and then I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. I'm going to create, like, I'm basically a god now. And no, I'm not, because that person is going to end up with osteoporosis, incontinence, pain, no sexual function. This is what's happening. They've used a hell of a lot of euphemisms, like, puberty blocking and bottom surgery and top surgery and masculinization chest surgery and, my true self. These are all euphemisms for some really horrific medical harm that is being inflicted. And because you can't fight nature, you're just going to fight nature to, you'll be deluded to think that you can win over something that's been inherent to living beings for millions of years. It's just like, I mean, come on, But, they have found a drug that will do something, and they ran with it. It's just astonishing.
I looked. Now, I'm not a medical professional, but like I looked into Lupron because it was it was used for women with endometriosis in the U.S., and it's also approved for prostate cancer, and it's something that they use for medical castration of people that are the minor attracted persons, like I'm just saying it that way because we're on YouTube, and they'll censor, they'll grab me for, the censorship is awful.
Wow.
But it's crazy because the ACLU is in the United States is fighting against that drug being used on people that abuse children and that are caught. Like they're fighting against that, but at the same time they are fighting for it to be used off label for children. And I'm like, if people can't see how sinister this is, and can't see like I mean, there's thousands and thousands of lawsuits against Lupron itself, which is the puberty blocker, from women from like that have osteoporosis. Like teenagers are getting osteoporosis from that drug, and yet they're still like, it's just being given out, but they're fighting against adults having it for medical castration. And I'm just like, this is it feels absolutely like just insane. Like it's just like, how is this even reality? It's so difficult to even understand like what is happening.
Well, I think what's happening is institutional capture by gender ideology. So our institutions are no longer able to act independently from their gender ideology overlords. So, it's managing society, I think, is very difficult at the best of times, right? There's all kinds of influences and interests and whatever. But one thing that has really brought us out of the dark age as a society is science and evidence, and making policies and decisions on a population level based on science and evidence, not based on feelings, fancies, religions, doctrines, things like that. No, we look at, the reality of it. We do studies. We then want those studies to be of good quality, because this is the best way we as society so far have to avoid, harm. Because if we, if we focus on what we want to be the outcome and reverse engineer evidence in order to suit the outcome, we have corrupted the whole process. And I think this is what's happening now, because this ideology has given the desired outcome and has managed to co-opt institutions to cooperate with this mindset. So the desired outcome, according to these people, is that anyone has access to drugs and medical procedures that will make them cosmetically appear as one sex or the other, or neither sex, or whatever. So this is the desired outcome. And we have to now make policies such to permit that. And if there happens to be an inconvenient evidence that goes, ding, 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 this is actually really dangerous, these kids are suffering, suppress, because that compromises this ultimate outcome. And this ultimate outcome has been presented as a human right. And this is a key word that, and they liken themselves to the civil rights movement. They liken themselves to the LGBT rights movement. These are very fresh in human memory, plights of these populations for equality, for life free of oppression. They've co-opted all of those terms and words and ideas to present this very sinister, very ideological and harmful outcome, to equate it. And it's thought terminating, because the moment someone says, but hang on a minute, this is harming children, they will counteract that with, you are oppressing and denying human rights of these people to be their true authentic selves. I mean, never mind that, no one has become true and authentic through cosmetic surgery and drastic body modification. That's the opposite of being your true self. Your true self is who you actually are, warts and all. But this is, and it's not happened overnight. This ground has been laid for the past 20, 30 years, and we have unfortunately only found out in the last probably 5 to 10 years where we are. But institutions are so knees deep, neck deep in this, and there is no scope to move. You see people who are sitting in these institutions knowing this is wrong, but unable to say anything because the reprisals will be severe. And I think that's where we are. So you cannot make sense out of it. You can just identify it as very sinister and very wrong and try to figure out how you can undo this, because there is a way out of this. Even though they'd like you to think that there is no way out of this, this is how things are now. No one's ever won a war on reality. Reality is going to crash into this ideology. The longer this goes on, the harder it's going to be. So yeah, we just accept that there is no sense, no sense to any of this, and just it's a bad thing that needs to be dealt with, I think.
We have a question from one of my friends here in the audience. They said, "Can you ask your guests how autism and/or brain injuries are affecting decision making or lack thereof in the transgender community and the trans rights activist community?"
Thank you for the question. It's a excellent question, and I think a lot can be said about this. But I would just like to pick a few things that might make sense. Autism often involves so-called concrete thinking. So these people can be quite literal. Also,
that's what's very confusing. I just want to point, that's very confusing to me because of the rate of how they are getting autistic people that are usually very concrete and truth-based people. And they're like getting people that have autism to believe into an ideology and manipulating them. It's astonishing to me that they are able to do that.
Well, I think primarily targeting autistic children and teens. Autism, obviously, it exists on the spectrum, so there is a big range of issues that people can be, affected with. But some of the things that do come up quite often are, a degree of obsessive and compulsive thoughts. So ability to hyper focus on an issue and then just run with it. So have these extreme intense interests in a single topic that will just,
I know it very well. I know it very
right?
well.
So, and also then you have this issue of, autistic people also go through puberty. We all have, we all feel like really messed up during puberty. Like, I don't know anyone who wasn't tortured and angsty and hated their body and hated their parents and hated everyone and desperate to fit in. But, you're very confusing time. So when you have that for someone who is also atypical in a sense that they can't as easily as some other children just go along, go with the flow, blend in. They're always different, and they often attract abuse and bullying and all that kind of stuff. So they have an internal turmoil. They have a turmoil socially. They might struggle with connecting on a physical level. So, they might not make eye contact. They might be get more peace and comfort from, say, things rather than people. All that kind of stuff plays a role why autistic children will be then feeling particularly isolated and particularly desperate and to fit in but not know how. And then you add on to that the bodily changes. There is sensory issues with autism and sensitivity to all kinds of things. And if you then, particularly with girls, your breasts are growing, you start getting a period, and then you start getting sexualized, because when you're walking down the street to your school in your uniform, the guy who is being an awful man, screaming sexualized cat calls at you, he doesn't know that you're autistic. And then an autistic person can take that as, just get this out of me, get my breasts away, get all of this, I don't want this, and then you have this ideology that goes, aha, all of your problems can be solved if you become a boy, and you can actually become a boy. And then this child hyper focuses on forums, information, which is all very designed to groom children. It's designed to convince children, autistic or not, children are vulnerable to influence and grooming. And so I think, there are just some of the reasons why autistic children or neurodivergent children can hyper focus on this, can feel so deeply in their bones that if they can only get this, everything will be fine. Their life will not be as hard, not realizing that life is probably going to continue to be different than someone who doesn't have that condition. And then as they grow, they will grow into themselves like everyone else in their own way. But this ideology just comes in from the left field and just harnesses all this. And next thing you know, and then these children, because they can be so intensely interested in this and feel so passionate about helping others and telling others how this has helped them. They can come to believe what they are told, that it is actually a fact. And it only down the line, when the harm actually becomes apparent, they can no longer deny that this hasn't helped, that this has harmed. And then they try to speak out about it, and they get ostracized from their own community because they're an inconvenient fact that this is not a panacea that's been sold as, and yeah. So I think, and these children, because these young people, because they can be so hyper focused and research, and they can sit online a lot and campaign a lot, I think, and then at the same time not really quite being able to understand more nuanced arguments, to separate, because they're now so focused on this. You have quite a lot of neurodivergent people amongst trans activists. You have a lot of neurodivergent people who are targeted by this ideology. And yeah, so either way, this also goes on with adults as well. I know women in their 30s, very intelligent scientists and whatever, who never felt they fitted in. They never felt, like a woman that society says this is what a woman is. They never felt quite like that. And now they've been targeted by this ideology. They've had their mastectomies. They are they, thems now. And they are, promoted by the ideology as spokespeople. And they're just being used, these are just advertisements. Children and people who undergo these changes are just, they're just advertisements for the whole ideology. And the moment that they no longer have the impact, they're just discarded, but the machine goes on.
Yeah, and they get almost like they get love bombed, right? And so it's very typical that you get love bombed, you're finally getting acceptance and all of this, and you're part of something.
Yeah.
And I feel like that right there, that part of it, it's like, oh, it's just
extraordinary sinister, isn't it?
It is. It's heartbreaking, and then we there's so many like layers to this.
Yeah.
Like it is so multi-layered. I mean, it's a linguistic thing. It's a, like they use they use the abuse tactics, and it feels almost like, like when you talk about like domestic violence and like, an abusive relationship, it feels like that same, you know what I mean? Like it hits those same key points that you hear within like, an abusive relationship. Oh, they love bomb you. And then they, you know what I mean? Or that cult mentality, when like, you look at any of the cults around the world, in any point in history, it's like, oh, if you leave, if you detest, like you leave that cult, then immediately you're hated, you're scum, you're no longer part of that community, and you're only given that acceptance while you are internally part of it. And like, and then once you leave, it's like, if it was really, if they really cared about the people, then they would care about them no matter what. If they detransitioned or not, they would still accept them and want them to be healthy and happy. But it doesn't work that way. It's quite the opposite. It's like, if you become a detransitioner, then you are even worse. You are worse than what they label as the TERFs or the gender critical, or the biology realists. Like, whatever way you want to, like, if you are questioning this ideology in any way, you like, it's like, if you become trans and then you would detransition, you are even lower on their totem pole, because you were part of that and they did accept you into like that family, like the glitter family type deal. So it's like, it's even worse. They get even more hate. And then those of us that are just like out here going, oh my gosh, like, this is horrible that you went through that, then like, we get attacked for supporting them, and then we get accused of like love bombing them. And I'm just like, no, I just care about people, and I care about you guys enough, everybody. Like, if people didn't care, they say we're hateful if we speak up against it, but it's actually that we care about people enough that we are willing to take the heat to speak up, to say, I see people being harmed. I see people suffering. And I can't just stand by and just like let that happen and not speak up for them. I can't do that. Like, it's just not in my nature.
Absolutely. But again, this is also quite a nuanced, it's turned out to be quite a nuanced situation. So, so first of all, just to go back to what you said about the gender lobby doesn't really care about the harm. It's not even just the transitioners, it is people who are, quote unquote, still in their chosen identity, suffering some consequences that is being completely suppressed, and who are basically warned not to talk about it because it can make the whole ideology and the whole dogma look bad, because we are told that these surgeries are mostly that hardly anyone regrets this, because this is all sunshine and lollipops once you go through these procedures or take these medications. And they don't want people who are still embodying that chosen identity talking about the complications and things like that. So you can just relate that back to the fact that this is not about children at all. This is about the cohort mostly of adult males with a sexual motivation for their identities, who 95+% of the time do not have any of these interventions that children are pushed into having. So these children, and what happens to these children, is not at the forefront of this ideology's mind. But to go back to now the detransitioners, the issue with supporting is not that they shouldn't be supported, it absolutely should, but it has kind of gone a little bit into a territory where you have a person who maybe who was love bombed whilst undergoing these interventions, then decided to stop for health reasons and is now trying to figure out what's going on. They got ostracized, they lost their entire support network, they were probably quite isolated, and they come on Twitter, for example, they write a thread, and in 24 hours they have 10,000 likes. They immediately get back to that attention and celebration. And in all of that, that in itself would not be a problem at all. But because so many people are so desperate to stop this, it has become a bit of a problem that detransitioners are seen as people who can save others. Whereas these people are very often arriving sick, in pain.
They're traumatized. Yeah, they're traumatized. Like,
they need help. And instead, they're now on the receiving end of endless DMs and phone calls and invitations to speak and whatever, that, from parents of children, from other people who, have fallen down the rabbit hole and don't know how to get out. And instead of actually receiving help, for their physical condition, which is often very neglected and needs a lot of care and recovery, and psychological as well, they're immediately plunged into this caregiver role. And the expectation, and because they empathize, they know how other people are struggling and how important it is to help. They're often very empathic people and very hardworking people. I mean, you know, Sinead and Tulip and so many of them have done so much work trying to help that I worry. You know, I sit there and I worry about them giving so much of themselves before, whereas it's them who should be receiving help and time to process and to heal. So I understand why this has happened, and you know, there is no blame anywhere, but I just kind of, if people could just be a little bit more mindful that, you know, those people who, they need to have time to recover and then come of their own accord and say, now I'm ready to help. You know, like when you have,
That's what I tell them.
But
That's
when you have
them.
an addict, you know, an addict needs to first recover and then go work with other addicts. Because if an addict is just very shaky and still trying to recover and at the same time trying to help others, it's too much, you know. Not to say that these people are addicts, but it's kind of a parallel. So that's my only reservation. So I just kind of would just like to ask people, please don't put these expectations, don't reach out in such massive numbers for their input, for their help. Let them give you what they have to give you and offer help to them instead, I think would be better for the detransitioners in general.
That's what I do. I tell them, I'm like, listen, I'm here for you. We can, you know, like I'll talk with you. And if I'm going to like Prisha Mosley, like before, like I reported on like her entire, she did a court, a lawsuit recently. And I contacted, you know, cause I'm in contact with a lot of them, but like, they know that my door is open. If they ever are, if they do want to come and they want to have a conversation and they know that like my door is open, but I don't pressure them to come and to speak out, but it's here and they know it's here if they want it. And I think that that's a much healthier place for them to be. And it's like a lot of times they'll get contacted by like these huge, like, you know, they'll get bombarded with like huge, like news organizations and these like a lot of an immense amount of pressure to publicly speak. And of course they want to publicly speak, but it takes a lot out of them. And they just sometimes they need to have support and, you know, like I'll check in on them and say, you know, how are you doing? And it's nothing to do with like me trying to like lure them on to like come and do a podcast with me or anything like that. It's just because I genuinely care about them. But like I always just say, like, you know, my door is open. If you want it, you know what I mean? If not, that's perfectly fine too. I'm still going to be here for you. You know, I'm a mother, you know, I care about these people and I care that they've gone through like something that is like very traumatic. And I see myself in a lot of them, you know, being somebody that is neurodivergent and, you know, just growing up as a tomboy and just like always kind of like having that, you know, I see a lot of like, you know, I see a lot of myself in them. And I'm just like, you know, I would have liked to know that somebody was there for me. Just to know that they're there doesn't mean you have to act on it. Just to know that if you do need a shoulder to cry on, you have somebody that's going to be there. And it's got to be overwhelming, the amount of like, you know, they get like this almost opposite love bombing. You know what I mean? Like they get it from everybody else. And it's like, but what happens, you know, when people move on from you, you know what I mean? When, you know what I mean? Like after there's a new person that's come out. So like, you know, everyone wants the new person, you know what I mean? Like, and I see what you're saying. Like, absolutely. I think that it can definitely be almost the same effect that we're seeing when people are coming out as trans and they're doing like celebratory, you know, parties for them. And like, you know, I can't imagine like going through that. Like, I absolutely like changing your entire outward physical appearance, and then like, you know, integrating into society and feeling like everybody's like absolutely against you, and you have this like social justice like warrior in you, and having to fight for it, and then coming to terms with, oh, that wasn't really what I, you know, that really wasn't the solution to what I was going through. And, you know, it's like we're skipping the steps of people getting help and therapy and just having support.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, it all happens very quickly, you know. The realization that somebody has to detransition or stop taking those medications, or that the surgery was a mistake, that kind of hits you. And then what, you know? And then the time, you know, you may have been building up to these procedures for like 5 to 10 years, being part of the community, and then getting your blockers, and then getting this, and then surgery and whatever. This took like a decade, and suddenly within 18 months, you've given up your drugs and your you know, your hormones, and you're looking at the damage and that was done to your body, and you've lost all your support. It happens so quickly. You need a long time to process that. And what particularly concerns me as a doctor is that once people are, you know, once young women have had their uteruses taken out and their ovaries taken out, or once they've had their permanent damage done by opposite sex hormones, same with males, you know, when they have, you know, penectomies or whatever else, these people are very highly complex cases for endocrinological care, for rehabilitation, for psychosocial support. A lot of these people are too distressed. Often they might have developed substance misuse issues just to cope with the pain and the anguish of being at the end of the road, and not that their problems haven't gone away. They now have a whole host of new problems that are not going to be reversible. This is just massive. So, you know, we don't even have specialized services yet to take these people and to just medically sort them out, and to put them in touch with therapists for long-term therapy and psychosocial support, whether there are jobs or, you know, education or whatever. You know, there's so much there, so much need, health and mental and physical health need amongst the transitioners, and there is just nothing. I mean, I've heard that people have been begging for months and months and months just to get a female detransition, just to get female hormones, because she's now in premature ovarian failure. Literally, she's in premature menopause in her early 20s. That is going to make her feel absolutely rubbish, like, you know, physically and psychologically. And no one wants to touch her with a 10-foot pole, because all these people have worked themselves up to do is to transition someone. And they're even then brainwashing this poor woman into saying, oh, so you now want to transition into a female. And it's like, no, she is you stop it. This is a female. This was done to her by your bloody colleagues. You need to do the right thing. You know what the right thing is. If you had a 21-year-old who had uterine cancer and had her, a reproductive organ removed, you would know what to do for her. You know what to do for this woman, but they don't dare because of the capture, and because then they would have to admit that this is not, you know, the wonderful rainbows and lollipops practice. And the whole thing is just so off-piste, and these poor people are just in the middle of it, and my heart goes out really to them. And I think if we could collectively focus more on just procuring these services, and at least just getting into mainstream the fact that these services are desperately now needed worldwide. That's what we need. We don't need more waiting lists and specialized services that will put more children on this path. We need more services to help people who have been harmed by this.
Yeah, I mean, I've even heard from medical professionals that have told me that there's not even, you know, like in the medical field, there's codes in the, you know, in the U.S. and I'm not sure how it works where you are, but you know, there's codes for everything, but there's no codes for the people that are dealing with these issues, that are either whether they're a transgender or transsexuals, or, you know, if they're a detransitioner. There's no medical codes for them. And like that's like, it's absolutely mind-blowing that they're doing things to people and they don't know the consequences of it. It just shows that it's all experimental. And and saying that is like, you get so much hate for just saying that, and that's the truth. And it's like, why is it, why is it that we're putting feelings over the truth? Like, why is it that like these things suddenly don't matter to people? Like, to me, it's like, it's like the truth matters, biology matters, our bodies are like these amazing machines that like, I mean, just, it's incredible. Our bodies are absolutely incredible. Like the way that we fight disease, the way that our bodies react to when we get an infection, and like just the way that our bodies naturally like go through, like women's bodies, like we go through, our whole entire menstrual cycle, how we can grow another human and then make the milk to produce, like, to feed that child. Like, I mean, it's an amazing thing. Like, being a mom, I breastfed for 2.5 years, and like, there was things that I I had to watch, like, everything I ate. I had to watch every like thing I put in my body, the medications, the exposure to things. Like, I had to make sure that you have to go back and forth between, like, your breast, because you can get, like, infections, and there's just so much to it. And then now we have males that are taking these hormones that are not designed for their bodies, and they're, I don't even know what it is that's coming out, but
It's ideological medicine. So this is what we mentioned earlier. When you have your outcome in mind, and that outcome now rules your practice as opposed to evidence that you encounter along the way, this is what happens. And this is not unprecedented in human history. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of Lysenkoism in Russia under Stalin. So Lysenko was a guy who has devised this practice and this philosophy that flew in the face of what is scientifically known about how genetics of crops are working. And the whole idea is that in Soviet Russia, they had a belief that it's not the plant genetics or the inheritance modes that we are familiar with, but some other things that rule the outcome of how successful crops will be, such as what we do, to them, how we modify them, or how we plant them, or how we, so it's like inheritance versus environment, and it got put upside down. And Lysenko was celebrated, and this was supposed to be inherent to the Soviet Russia's supremacy and their intellectual supremacy. And we're going to make this work. We're going to make this work. We're going to make this work. 50 million people die of starvation. But along the way of this being quite evident that this is not how agriculture is going to work, and that the quote unquote corrupt Western idea of genetic inheritance is not corrupt Western idea of inheritance, is just how things are scientifically, was completely ignored. And scientists ended up in gulags, and people starved until eventually they had to bloody stop it. But it ran for quite a long time. So humans are ideologically quite capable of acting very insanely about something that is really evident and ignoring evidence. And I think this is what's happening now. I refer to this as gender Lysenkoism, because it's doing the same thing. It is ignoring the facts of life, biology, biological sex, evidence, how medicine works, all of these basic principles, for the sake of this ideological thing that we now, in our exalted state, as we know better than everyone else, and we are going to manifest what's in our heads in reality. And of course, that is, sometimes you can manifest something if it actually doesn't conflict with reality, but in this case it does, and they're still running with it. And we are now in that process of that horrific harm being just ignored for the sake of the ideological idea.
So what is it that like, coming from a medical professional, what do you think it is that is being excreted from men's chests as they are taking these hormones? I mean, some of them are calling it milk. I don't I don't know what it is. I think it's probably highly toxic for an infant to ingest, but that's happening, and it's really alarming. And I thought that that would like really like make more people upset, but there are organizations defending it, in the United States. Like I don't. I'm kind of floored by it, because I breastfed for 2.5 years, and I didn't take Tylenol. Like I didn't take anything. I avoided certain foods. I was super cautious and careful, and I mean the amount. As from my understanding, the amount of hormones that you have to take if you're taking the opposite sex hormones forcefully, you're taking a larger amount of that hormone, and it's often compared to like, oh well, women naturally have those hormones in their body, but those aren't women that are doing this. This is men that are attempting to feed a child.
Okay, so what's coming out of these men's chest is called milky fluid, and the phenomenon of milky fluid excretion via a nipple outside of the context of pregnancy is called galactorrhea, and it is an abnormality. It's a sign of endocrinological abnormality.
Yeah, it happened to me. It happened to me when actually I would it happened to me, and I went because it happened, I went to a doctor to get checked out because it happened later on in life. So yeah, like
yeah, so it can happen to both men and women. It's the way sex development works is that we all start as a single cell. And if you can imagine that you and my friend Bob and, my friend's child Susie, we all started as a single cell. And in that single cell, we have our karyotype, we have all the chromosomes and whatever, and then we have the specific sex chromosomes. Every person normally will have two of those, either XX or XY. Now, there are some abnormalities. You can have more copies or less copies, but fundamentally speaking, females have two X chromosomes, males have X and Y. And it is these complements of sex chromosomes, XX versus XY, that drive differentiation of tissues as that first cell multiplies and multiplies unimaginable number of times. Cells then get these genes will activate other genes, will produce proteins, enzymes, and they will all direct tissues to develop in a certain way. So the way males don't have the full information genetically to develop a mature female adult breast. But because we all started as a single cell, you can imagine that many things we share, and it's just a matter of degree, or whether this development will proceed, or if it won't proceed, it will be stopped and something else will supplant it. This is how, embryology is very fascinating. So what happens is that both males and females get born with breasts, with breast buds and stuff. But it is only females that have full genetic information for that breast to mature at puberty into adult female breast. And then that adult female breast, under the effect of pregnancy hormones, is biologically programmed to then start producing milk, and that milk is tailored to the baby, and it goes through stages from colostrum to transitional milk to mature milk, and it responds to needs of the baby, to the sex of the baby, to the pathogens in the environment, to whether a woman can hear a baby cry in the supermarket, and if she's a breastfeeding mother, the milk is going to start squirting out.
Yep.
The milk composition will change before even mother knows that the baby will spike a fever, because the connection between mom and the baby, it is something that is very unique and also ubiquitous to all the females and the babies. So it's a pure biological function. But men have some kind of breast there, that also has some rudimentary ducts that if their hormones, because again, we share our hormones, we all have estrogen, we all have progesterone, we all have prolactin, and we have testosterone in different amounts. And some amounts are appropriate for female, some amounts are appropriate for male, some amounts are appropriate for pregnancy, some amounts are appropriate for non-pregnant, not being pregnant, and things can go hormonally wrong. So, when we have, there are medications out there like, some antipsychotics, or there are diseases like some cancers, tumors, things like that can actually disturb the hormonal balance inside a male or a female, and the milk or milky discharge will start. But if that milky discharge occurs outside of pregnancy, it's abnormal, and it's a sign that we need to check what's wrong, and often something needs to be done, because if this hormonal imbalance persists for a long period of time, it's very damaging to the body. The body wants to maintain a so-called equilibrium. We know what is right, what are the right levels of everything, and if anything becomes abnormal, it usually has some health consequences. So what is coming out of male chest, because they don't have fully developed breasts, and even when they are taking estrogen to enlarge the male breast, which is, again, doesn't become a female breast, it's called gynecomastia, which is an abnormal enlargement of male breast. The architecture of that breast inside is not the same as a female. So whatever abnormal fluid that they're producing, they can't produce adequate amounts of it. And it then becomes even more problematic if they're actually actively taking drugs and hormones and things that will induce that process. Because, as you know, drugs pass into the mother's milk, and it can, we have all these things. Is this drug safe in breastfeeding or not, etc. But because you are operating in a climate of ideological medicine, where the most important thing is that this man, who is a woman trapped in a man's body, self-actualizes and experiences his quote-unquote femininity via breastfeeding a child, that is most important. We then cannot look into the process by which we are making this happen. We cannot look at any danger or harm that results from that, because if we do, we may find ourselves denying this man his human right to experience this process. And because we have now in ideological medicine decided that his human right to experience this process, for whatever reason, is key and the primary goal, everything else has to be tailored to that outcome. So this is why I think, the trans activists don't help by calling everyone a Nazi and a bigot for denying them whatever they want all the time. And this is how it happens. And I think the trans activists have targeted women's health particularly anything that has to do with uniquely female functions, because autogynephilia, which is a paraphilia that some of these men have, involves a desire to experience uniquely female physiological functions, not in every person, but menstruation fetish, lactation fetish, pregnancy fetish, abortion fetish. This is just, all an integral part of it. It's all swept under the carpet because we're not supposed to talk about it, but that's what is very real. And you will often find that, these men who are promoting this practice also have OnlyFans pages on which they are enacting this exact fetish, but we cannot talk about it, can't talk about it. And if anyone dares, they will lose the funding, they will be called a bigot. And this is how evidence gets lost, and evidence of harm in particular, for the sake of this ideological outcome, which basically says that trans people are sacred, and any man who wants this has purest motives in the universe. And furthermore, that this has to be safe. I mean, it just has to. It has to be safe. And this is kind of the mindset that they're in. And any challenge to this has become impossible. So you end up getting completely ridiculously incompetently written studies that are trying to assert that this is fine and this is okay and this is great and no one's getting harmed. And any doctor or anyone who knows how to read studies is reading it and is going, what is this steaming pile? I mean, for crying out loud, if you try to write this about any other medical topic, you would be laughed at because there are glaring holes that you are just ignoring. But because it's this particular area, no, you cannot challenge it. And, it's just, they're all running with it. And next thing you know, we are here. So, but it is a milky discharge that is probably adulterated by abnormal levels of hormones and drugs that should not under any circumstances be fed to any child, in my opinion. There is some historical evidence that men who have had hormonal imbalances in extreme situations, like say long sea voyages, when there was an infant and the mother died and there was no access to anything, and there happened to be a man who likely had a pituitary tumor, was excreting something, was anecdotally reporting as quote unquote breastfeeding the child. And even then it was recognized that it was simply helping the baby to hydrate. It wasn't adequate replacement. And this is in a context of a man simply having a disorder and hormonal imbalance, as opposed to just a host of drugs that are also in that fluid. So they're now using that as evidence that this is, historically safe practice. No, it isn't. This is just anecdotal, desperate actions of fathers with, faced with really extreme situations. So yeah, no, not a good idea. Do not feed it to the baby. Needs to be stopped, in my opinion. It's not safe. It's not safe for that man or for that child. So
yeah, and I'm in the field, like I'm in the like, whatever. If you wanna do that, what I mean, if you wanna risk yourself and you wanna like pump whatever that is, you don't need to feed. If it's part of your fetish, then you don't need to feed it to a baby. Like that, there's no level of affirmation that needs to happen that we put a child at risk. I mean, I can't even imagine that child later on growing up and finding out, oh yeah, as a baby I was plastered all over the internet and everybody was telling, like my parent that they shouldn't be doing this to me. You know what I mean? And who knows? It feels just completely wrong. All of this. I mean, there's literally transgender people that are saying that they want to have the first uterus transplant that's successful so they can have an abortion. And it's like being a woman who is miscarried and had to go through procedures like that is not a positive experience. Why would anybody want to go through something that is emotionally hard, that is physically hard? Like, it feels like a slap in the face of womanhood and the struggles that we go through. Like we haven't even, we haven't even had our own bathrooms for very long in the United States. We haven't always had the right to vote. We haven't always had the right to wear pants in this country, but yet we can have these men fetishize us and do this. And it's like, no, this is just a hard line for me. This is absolutely a no, especially when it comes to the children.
Well, the nature of fetishism, which is well known and understood in forensic psychiatry, for example, has been buried for ideological reasons. So one of the things that fetish does, part of the reason why fetishes develop is because they're mostly a male thing anyway. Like 99% of fetishism affects males. And it arises because a man is, for a variety of psychological reasons, unable to deal with women as a whole. So he will focus on a part. So fetishism is deconstructing. It is a very narcissistic process where a person does not see the woman as a human being, complete human being, but may focus on her feet or on her breasts or on her menstruation. It is something to acquire, something to possess, something to have intercourse with. It is a thing. So a part of a woman, obviously not all fetishes involve body parts, but for this particular fetish, because their fetish is about autogynephilia is about being sexually aroused at the thought of having intimate relationships as a woman. So a man,
so they want to see themselves as an actual woman.
What arouses these men, not all of the men, but just the men who have autogynephilic fetish, what arouses them is the idea that they are engaging in intercourse as women, that they have become women, their bodies, their minds, whatever they think a woman is. And what they think a woman is a fetishist outlook. So a woman is not, you know, a whole human being with a history and with inner life and with, you know, no, it is that one part of her that most excites him, and that he really is all that it cares about. And another thing is with fetishes is that they escalate. So this kind of fantasy is never where it's at, and that's where the man can just visit it comfortably at that level, get his satisfaction, get the relief, and move on. No,
Oh, it's ever growing then?
escalation. Yeah, there's constant
Oh.
escalation. You see that with pornography, you see that with sex crimes, you see that with a variety of things. It's never good, because ultimately this is not a psychologically healthy, it's a psychosexual disorder. So it's not a psychologically healthy and fulfilling activity. It is fundamentally an activity that is unfulfilling, humiliating, shameful. It gives all kinds of feelings to them, and then they, you know, wait until they can't help it anymore, then do it again. And then, you know, when they see that they can get away with something, then they hyper focus on the next stage. So, you know, you might start by wearing women's clothing, but down the line, as you escalate, you end up wanting to have breasts. You want to escalate to end up removing your penis. You know, it just kind of goes on and on like that. So I think that is why that's why this doesn't work, is because you cannot contain it, and it will always escalate to dangerous levels. And I think people are forgetting the fetish component of all of this, because a man wanting to breastfeed is not normal in any way. Maybe he's not tethered to reality and he wants to do it for those reasons, but if he's, you know, embodying reality and doing this because it excites him or whatever, this will always escalate. And I think that's where the danger comes from, is because you cannot contain it at what could be potentially a safe level, make-believe, fantasy, this and that. It always kind of wants to intrude more and more. And I think women's boundaries and transgressing women's boundaries, it's what is quite inherent in this entire phenomenon, at least from the male perspective. And, you know, that has a very long history of men just not wanting women to have anything away from males for a variety of reasons, obviously sexual access, domination, things like that. So we are really fighting some very pervasive and historic forces here that have prevented historically women from having rights, from having safety. And it's all now been erased for the sake of this novel so-called human rights movement that completely negates all that and just posits these desires and these assertions as a human right of these men, and forgets that this is not necessarily safe, this is not necessarily containable. So yeah, I think that is that would be the way I look at that whole, you know, like male lactation thing.
Yeah, that's you explain it so well, in a way that I can only relate it from like my personal experience and like, you know, what I've understood. But you understand like the much larger picture, especially coming from a medical background, what the differences are and what that is. And I really, really appreciate you explaining that, because like these are such complex issues, but they're also very simple issues. Like to me, I'm just like, no, women are telling you that it's not okay to do that. Women are telling you that you know, we're worried about the child's health. Like, you know, that should be that is like, as a mother, you know, it was always about, you know, what was best for the child. Like I did everything I could to ensure that as a mother I wasn't causing any harm to my child, and it seems like it's just absent in that. It's completely just, it's just not even a factor to some of these people where they're, you know, the fetishization of doing that act is more important than the child. And it just, to me, that's abusive. That is absolutely, you know, like that. It shouldn't happen. It shouldn't be supported. It shouldn't, you know. And then also I think about like, wow, if there's this many people that are outwardly doing it, how many people are doing it behind closed doors that are not talking about it, that are not, because they know that they're going to get raked through the coals and they're going to get hate for doing it. How many people are doing it behind closed doors that are not even, that we have no idea about? And the ones that do stick their neck out there and that are like, oh yeah, it's perfectly fine to do this. Like it paves a way for people to do it.
Yeah, I mean, we've gone from, if 50 years ago, if you saw a man trying to put his nipple into a baby's mouth, there would be not one person on this earth who would not recognize that as potentially abusive and problematic. They might not know exactly why the man is doing it. Maybe he's confused. We don't have to prejudge exactly why he's doing it. But we knew that this was a risk situation and that we needed to intervene and stop it. But now, because, and that's because our culture has decided a long time ago that children matter, that children's safety matter. They've noticed that men do potentially pose a risk to women and children. I mean, adults pose risk to children as well. This is what safeguarding is based on, understanding these things and prioritizing the most vulnerable and the most innocent and giving them the best chance at life to grow up until they can fend for themselves, basically. So this is like, fundamentals of safeguarding. So 50 years ago, if you saw that, no one would be confused. They might not know exactly what's happening, but they would stop it. But now, because our focus is no longer on the child, it is on these men or women who want to transition, and they have their own, set of issues that may affect children, like testosterone and things like that. We have now, and this is why this narrative about these people being so vulnerable and so fragile, because it's in a way like what we mentioned before, infantilization of adults and adultification of children. The boundaries between adult and child are being erased, and children are being ascribed the kind of autonomy and ability to safeguard themselves, whilst the adults are being ascribed the kind of vulnerability, and none of that will actually then result in this safeguarding framework for just being removed, basically. So I think that is a further concern. And if you read these studies, you will see the studies that are promoting this practice. You will see no mention of, you will see hardly any focus on the child. Whereas anything that has to do with breastfeeding, primary focus normally is on the child, benefit, risks, this and that. Children are completely lost in all of these write-ups. They're barely mentioned. The sex is barely mentioned. Hardly any effort is made to ensure that this child is okay, to witness the process. Because, as we also mentioned before, the whole coercive control, mothers and children, they're quite vulnerable to coercive male partners sometimes. I don't see any honest attempt to ascertain that these mothers have actually consented. None of that. All kinds of dynamics could be going on behind closed doors, and everyone is just ignoring it and elevating this practice as something like some wonderful idea, as if going back to trans is sacred. Anyone who says that they're trans automatically cannot be a predator of any kind, because if somebody who said that they were trans is found to have been a predator, then the answer from these people is that, well, then they weren't trans to begin with.
I know.
There's no way, you can reason with them.
Every time they say, oh, they weren't trans if they detransition. They were never really trans. If it's a predator, they say, oh no, they were never trans. It's like they have all these like just built-in qualifiers and dismissive, they just dismiss it. And it's like, wait a minute here. Like, no, they identified that way. Like you say, if it's like you can self-ID and you become part of a protected class. And it's just, I mean, like, of course people are going to identify as that then. Of course, because people are like, oh, well, I can be, part of an oppressed class and I can get special rights and I can do no harm if I identify as this. And it's just, it's not.
This is what you get when you have a category that has no empirical evidence, because, you know, we are male or female, and that is very easy to detect and ascertain. So when a man is a predator, it's not that he's no longer a man, because we can confirm that he is. We can test his chromosomes, examine him, look at him, you know, he is a man. Whereas this trans concept hasn't actually even been clearly defined. Like, what is trans exactly? What some people are saying that they are trans, well, that's kind of meaningless, really, in an empirical sense. I can say that I'm a, you know, God. Who's gonna prove that I'm not? Maybe I'm God walking amongst humans. You know, that's not the basis on which we can actually create meaningful categories amongst humans. So that's why the trans thing is so has become so difficult to manage, because it's gotten equated through this conflation between sex and gender to something that is very concrete, very easily verifiable, and you can then start behaving in a very convenient way for your trans ideology by saying all the good people are trans, all the bad people, until we know that they're bad, are also trans, and they're given all of these privileges because trans is just like a thing. And now we found out that they've done something wrong, and suddenly they're not trans anymore. You don't have that luxury. You can't say, oh, she's not really female because she's sexually assaulted someone. No, she's still a female. We just have to grapple with that. But trans has this, because it's so poorly defined, has this convenience of, you know, Schrodinger, you know, effect. And very exploitable.
Yeah, and then it's also going to mess up like all the statistics that we have about men and women, and not just in the medical field, but like in sports, in every way that we are categorically different, and we are categorized as different people when it comes to the prisons, when it comes to, you know, like, you know, everything. It's going to mess up. It's going to mess up the statistics. I mean, like, I worry about people that are transsexual or transgender and present as the opposite, you know, the opposite sex, and without a full body examination or a medical history, you might not know that. And, you know, like the medical differences between males and females, what medicines are used and how they're, you know, like an EKG is read, or how, you know what I mean? There's just, we are very different as a species. And if you go there and you like having a medical emergency and you don't have any, you know, an advocate there for you, or this you know, the provider doesn't have that information, and you're taking cross-sex hormones, or you present as the opposite sex, I mean, that's got to be really difficult. And I can imagine that there's going to be a lot of incidences where people are, you know, are harmed with medicine because they're not told the truth.
Yeah, I mean, you know, in my book, I have covered a few cases where, you know, medical harm has occurred as a consequence of that. And also have a whole chapter of just examples upon examples of this kind of doublethink that is now occurring in medicine because of this ideology. But you're absolutely right. You know, we are sufficiently different that if you don't know that somebody is a female, you're not going to even consider a lot of differential diagnoses, and particularly things like pregnancy. So, you know, there are so many scenarios in medicine. There is not one scenario in which not knowing the biological sex of your patient would be at all acceptable. You know, even for a broken arm, if you're going to send someone for an x-ray and the person is of childbearing age, if they could be female, you would be medically negligent to not check whether they could be pregnant, because x-ray can affect the baby. Things like, you know, you're sending your bloods, and what is a normal hemoglobin for a female is actually anemia for a male. And if you're sending it, if you're changing medical records and calling a male female, and you're ordering the tests and the lab doesn't see the patient, they just see a test tube with blood in it and a request form, they're not going to flag up. And, you know, a man could be bleeding in his gut from something and his hemoglobin crashing, and he could have, you know, shortness of breath because of it and whatever. And the test is going to be returned as completely normal. And if you as a doctor are not capable of just holding that double think in your head consistently to then, despite the F, you see, so this hemoglobin is actually too low for a man because that man is an M, not an F. But let's not worry about what we put on the form. In an emergency situations, there are handovers. Patient present to A&E department. One doctor comes, the next doctor comes, things get handed over. Sometimes you don't get to discuss every one of your 17 patients who are sitting in your A&E, that you now have to take over. And information needs to be so precise and so thorough. And we in medicine know that record keeping, being crystal clear, having access to relevant records and information is so important, because it just takes so little for a clinical error to happen, and something so glaringly wrong, such as missexing a patient, unless you have all the space in your day and your brain and your time to have that double think, you can make a mistake and a patient can suffer. And female patients who identify as male and take testosterone have lost their babies because the staff in A&E did not realize that they were female or pregnant. I cover a case of a female who identifies as a man, whose renal transplant, her kidney transplant, was denied and delayed because the medical staff continued to use male equations to calculate her kidney function.
I remember reading that in the book and being astonished, like, holy shit, like, this is just going to get worse.
Oh, and you just the fact that she ended up, they all knew she was female. It's not that they were confused. And then she ended up having to beg them to put her on that list, and they still wouldn't do it. I mean, it just tells you how bad things can go in so many different ways. And again, if this ideology actually cared about people who identify as the opposite sex, if there is no other reason, it's something like that, why we cannot falsify sex with impunity, particularly in contexts where it is relevant. And just to me, that means is that, people like us who actually oppose this ideology and care about human bodies and health and safety of everyone, actually paradoxically care way more about people who identify as trans than trans lobby itself. It is crazy. And, these are vulnerable people. So, yeah, it's...
I know, we're so full of hate being concerned with them, aren't we? Ugh. I mean, oh my gosh. Like, and like, that's the thing, is that we're accused of that. We're accused of being bigots and hateful and Nazis and, like homophobic and transphobic and everything under the sun. And it's like, no, don't you understand though? I'm actually coming at this from a place of like actually being concerned with what's happening to people and doctors that are going to lose their like if you misgender somebody and like there's it's absolutely insane that we have to hold this double speak and act as though it's not true. Like, reality, we need to have things based in reality. We cannot, I mean, they're literally changing down to the license, down to the birth certificates, down to passports, down to everything. And they're changing their outward appearance cosmetically. Mm-hmm. But I think that we need to have something, like, there needs to be an in-between. There needs to be a qualifier where it says, at least, like your birth sex was this, because that matters. If somebody, if somebody gets hurt out on the street and they see, oh, this is a female, and they don't check, I mean, that this person is definitely, what is an actual, in fact, a female, because I mean, there are surgeries and there is transformations that happen that you literally, it would be very hard to tell unless you really, really knew that person was presenting as the opposite sex. And it's a cosmetic thing. It's not, you can't change every molecule down to, in your DNA. Like, that's just not happening. We do not have the technology for that. But even if you find their license, like, and somebody's hurt and you're like, oh, let's get them emergency medical care. And then they present as a female and their ID says female, and it doesn't say anything about them, about them being, transsexual or male, female or whatever, then we're really setting people up for the worst possible outcome and possible death. I mean, that is a fact. And that's not something that I think should be ignored at all.
No, and I think the people who are most at risk, in my opinion, are either young. So, masculinization in men is irreversible. So they've looked at the impact of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, and they don't actually, in the long term, reduce the height of these men. They don't prevent masculinization. Masculinization of a male body is quite a powerful force, and in order to suppress it, you're going to make that man very ill, and it eventually asserts itself. But because it's so irreversible, once you masculinize a female, then she does pass at first glance a lot more easily. And then particularly young people who are in that, puberty, adolescence is quite an androgynous stage. We all grow into our adult bodies. Females feminize by the end of adolescence, males masculinize by the end of adolescence. But that whole adolescence and young adulthood is really a time when these interventions can actually make someone look very convincingly of either sex as the opposite sex. And I think these people, so females who have masculinized, and adolescents or children in puberty or before puberty who have had their appearance modified, are at highest risk of being missexed visually. Because yes, documents missex everyone, but often you put your eyes on a patient, you see them and you can tell. But these particular patients tend to be then actually passing quite convincingly as the opposite sex. And like you said, there is just absolutely no safeguards left in place, not clinicians' eyes, not documentation. And it's not surprising that most of these harmful outcomes have affected young people, and particularly females.
Oh my gosh. Wait, I can't believe it. And just, it blows me away. I appreciate you coming on the show today. I can't believe it. We went past like the amount. I'm sorry. We've been just talking and I'm like, oh my gosh, we said like an hour and a half and we're almost to 2 hours. So oh my gosh, I really, really appreciate you coming on. You guys, please pick up the book. We're going to put the links in the show notes, wherever you're watching this, whatever platform. Please check out her book. It's amazing. It's set up in short essays. It's really easy to read. You can see that I've been, taking notes and like, I reference it. I go back to, things that I've even read, because while I'm in this and I'm trying to like learn and explore what is happening, it is so much information. It's so much to take in, but you have this book set up in such a way that it's so easy to digest and to reference back to. I'm so glad that I got it. I'm so glad that you came on to be a guest on the show. And I really look forward to reading more of your work as it comes out, and make sure you keep us up to date.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. It was an absolute pleasure to talk to you. And we had such an interesting conversation. So thank you.
Yes, absolutely. So stay right there and we will see everybody later. Thank you guys so much for coming. Please hit that like button wherever you're watching this from.
Thank you. Bye.